We already discussed the formation of contracts in our contracts unit. But now we're going to move to how the offer and acceptance process changes when we're talking about the sale of goods specifically under the UCC. So first of all, a written offer that's made by a merchant cannot be revoked for whatever time specified or for a reasonable time. If you'll recall, when we were talking about contracts, we said that if I make you an offer, as long as you haven't accepted it, I can revoke it, I can pull it back. But when it's from a merchant, remember a merchant is someone who habitually sells things, and it's written, that offer cannot be revoked. And it has to stay open for either the time specified by the merchant, or if the merchant doesn't specify a time, it needs to be left open for a reasonable time. In other words, the merchant cannot make the offer and pull it back immediately. The merchant has to leave it open. And so that's a difference from the classic contract rule that an offer can always be revoked if it hasn't been accepted. Now, turning to acceptance, there's no mirror image rule. Remember, there was an idea in classic contract doctrine that if I make you an offer and you make the acceptance, but you use a different formulation of words or there's a slight variation in terms, that might knock out the entire contract. That's not true with the sale of goods. You can have an agreement even though the buyer and the seller offered slightly different formulations of the way the terms worked. Acceptance is deemed to occur even if the buyer doesn't say anything, if the buyer takes the goods that are provided and does not reject them as non-conforming with the contract within a reasonable time. So if you sell me something, I take it and I hold on to it for some period of time, and I don't call you and say, hey, this thing that you sold me is not what I contracted for, then I am deemed to have accepted it. There doesn't need to be a formal acceptance. So offer and acceptance are a little bit different in this context. It's basically you can accept simply by taking the goods. You don't have to accept by saying anything. There's also no idea of substantial performance in the sale of goods context. And this is important because we talked about the fact that in most contracts, if you basically perform the contract, then that's deemed to be substantial performance. And if you have substantial performance, then the contract is mostly done, and you will get most of what is owed to you under that contract. But the perfect tender rule with regard to goods says no substantial performance. You have to provide precisely the goods that you were contracted to provide. And if you don't provide those goods, they can be rejected, all or in part, by the buyer. So you have to provide exactly what you were obligated to provide. The only exception to that is if you have an installment contract where you're giving some goods this month and some goods next month and some goods the following month in sort of an ongoing way, you, as the seller, can have the opportunity to cure. So maybe you didn't provide quite all of the goods that were required this month. You can cure that next month by providing extra. And so if you have an ongoing kind of installment contract relationship, then you can get the opportunity to cure. But otherwise, you have to provide perfect tender. You have to provide the goods that you were contracted to provide. Otherwise, they can be rejected by the buyer. Now, that brings us to the idea of curing. So the seller has a right to cure in a UCC sale of goods situation. So if a buyer gets some goods and says, oh, under the perfect tender rule, you've provided non-conforming goods. It's not what I purchased. The seller is allowed to try to cure that deficiency if it's before the delivery date by providing conforming goods. In this sense, it's to the seller's advantage to provide the goods before the due date. Because if they provide goods before the due date and it turns out those are non-conforming goods, they'll still have time to cure that by providing the conforming goods by the delivery date. In contrast, if it's after the delivery date, then the cure is only possible if the seller reasonably believes that the buyer would accept the goods with a price adjustment. You might not be able to cure at all. The buyer might simply say, forget it, you provided non-conforming goods, I'm not going to pay, we're done. But it's possible, if it's after the delivery date, that the seller could provide conforming goods with a price break, some sort of a reduction in the price, and then there's the ability to cure in that context. Now, we talked about offers and acceptances a little bit. What about if the buyer initially accepts but wants to revoke that acceptance? Well, if, as we just said, if the goods are non-conforming and the non-conformity was difficult to discover initially, then the buyer can revoke the acceptance. If you recall, we said that the buyer accepts simply by taking the goods and not saying anything. Well, what if the buyer takes the goods and then has them for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then suddenly discovers that the goods are inferior or defective or moldy or something like that? They couldn't have discovered it initially, but now they discover it. Well, then they can revoke acceptance. So even though they accepted it initially, they now can revoke acceptance. The other situation where a buyer can revoke acceptance is if the cure was not made. So maybe non-conforming goods were given. The buyer said, hey, you gave me non-conforming goods. The seller says, no problem, I'll cure that. I'll send conforming goods. The seller then doesn't do it. The buyer can then revoke the acceptance that was originally made. And that makes sense because the buyer still wouldn't have gotten the conforming goods that were contracted for. A notice of revocation of a contract has to be within a reasonable time after the discovery and the condition of the goods can't have been altered. So if you want to revoke the contract, if you want to say, I'm revoking my acceptance, you have to do that again within a reasonable time after you discover that it's non-conforming, and you can't have destroyed the goods in the meantime. Other differences between the UCC sales doctrine and the normal contract doctrine. Well, we talked about how if I make you an offer and you respond with additional terms, that's treated as a rejection of my original offer, and it's a new offer that you're now making with these new terms. That's also true, really, with regard to sales of goods unless both parties are merchants, unless they are both habitual commercial actors who are used to doing that. And if they're merchants, then the proposal actually becomes part of the contract, so long as the change is not material. If I propose to sell you something and you say, yes, that would be good, make sure you bring it to my back entrance, that's not a new contract offer. it just gets incorporated into the contract because we're both merchants used to a course of dealing, and if they really objected to bringing it around the back entrance, then they would say so. Now, it could be that the original offer limits acceptance just to its terms, or the seller might reject the proposal, say, no, I'm not bringing it around the back of the building, forget it. Then you wouldn't have a contract. But otherwise, it allows merchants to have a little bit more give and take, where they can just add some terms and have it immediately be incorporated into the contract. Now, if the buyer's acceptance does include these new terms, some courts will treat that as a proposal. Some courts will disregard the new terms. Some courts will apply a knockout rule, which basically says, well, the original term that the seller provided says one thing, the new term that the buyer provided says another. We're going to knock them both out and say that neither term governs. So you could have courts dealing with this in slightly different ways. And the more material the new term is, the more likely it is that a court's going to treat it as a proposal or disregard the new term. If it's not particularly material, if it's just about bringing it around the back entrance to the front entrance, chances are a seller is not going to object, and it'll just be deemed to have been incorporated into the contract. Modification rules. UCC contracts can be modified in good faith without consideration. So we talked about the fact that in a regular contractual agreement, you've got to have offer, acceptance, and consideration. Well, if you have a contract and then someone says, you know what, I need an extra 5 days to perform this contract, usually that would not be allowed unless you provided consideration for those extra 5 days. Something like, well, I'll pay you an extra $15 if you give me another 5 days, or I'll knock $15 off the price if you give me another 5 days to perform, something like that. But UCC contracts can be modified as long as it's done in good faith without consideration, as long as both parties agree. Remember, we looked at the statute of frauds in the contractual environment, and one of the areas where we need to have things be written is a sale of goods over $500. Remember, goods, that's the G in my legs for the statute of frauds. So contracts for the sale of goods over $500 have to be in writing under the statute of frauds. The UCC actually allows it not to be in writing if the goods have been delivered and accepted. So if we make an agreement that you're going to sell me goods that are over $500, we do it orally, you send the goods, I take the goods, everyone's happy, that's a contract, even though it violates the statute of frauds. So with regard to those goods, the statute of frauds says has to be in writing. UCC says not necessarily, as long as everyone's getting along and the goods have been delivered and accepted. So those are the primary differences between the common law of contracts and the UCC Article 2 for the sale of goods. And primarily, these rules are meant to sort of grease the wheels of normal business sales, particularly when it has to do with merchants selling to other merchants. And in those cases, we allow a little bit more loose, freewheeling activity with regard to how the contract happens, how the sale happens, giving the seller time to cure, allowing acceptance even when there hasn't been a formal acceptance, things like that, that just allow the business transaction to happen as it would normally happen in the course of business. The idea of the UCC was to try to incorporate normal business practices into contract law so that contract law reflected what the actual practice of merchants are. And so this is really a part of that, And so that's why these rules of sales are a little bit different from the classic contract idea.